was that I wasn't just leaving Thanksgiving dinner, I was leaving their lives forever. If you've ever felt completely invisible to the people you love most, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If stories like this touch your heart, please like and subscribe. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Sometimes just knowing we aren't alone is a comfort. 5 years before that Thanksgiving dinner, my husband David passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. Sometimes I can still hear the long, flat tone of the hospital monitor going silent. Sometimes I wake up still expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. After 43 years of marriage, losing him felt like losing half of my own heartbeat. David had always been the center of our family, not because he demanded attention, but because people naturally gravitated toward him. He was the kind of man who would fix a neighborhood kid's broken bicycle or spend his Saturday helping a stranger move furniture. When he laughed, everyone laughed with him, and when he hugged you, you felt entirely safe. So when he passed, something in our family changed forever. At first, I thought it was just grief. Everyone mourns differently. My daughter, Jennifer, buried herself in her work. She lived in a large house in the suburbs of Cincinnati with her husband, Brian, and their 2 daughters. My son, Michael, became distant almost overnight. He stopped calling as much, stopped visiting, and stopped asking how I was doing. For a long time, I made excuses for them. They're hurting too, I told myself. Just give them time. But time didn't heal what was happening. It only exposed it. The first Thanksgiving after David died felt strange, but manageable. The second was lonely. By the third, I started to notice that family gatherings revolved entirely around everyone except me. Conversations would drop whenever I walked near, and decisions were made without anyone ever asking for my input. Sometimes I felt less like their mother and more like an elderly relative they felt obligated to tolerate. Despite that, I refused to give up. Family was important to me. It always would be. Every Thanksgiving morning, I kept the traditions David and I had built over 4 decades alive. I'd wake up before sunrise, put on a pot of coffee, play old jazz records in the kitchen, and prepare recipes that had been passed down for generations. Sweet potato casserole, cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole, pumpkin pie, and David's favorite, the mashed potatoes. The recipe card still had his handwriting on it, and I'd touch it every year just to feel close to him. The Thanksgiving morning started the exact same way. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. The house felt quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that reminds you you're living alone. While the coffee brewed, I stood by the kitchen window, watching snow flurries drift across the backyard. For a split second, I imagined David standing next to me, smiling and teasing me about worrying too much. "Everything's going to be fine, Renee." That was always his favorite phrase. Everything's going to be fine. I wished I could still believe it. By noon, my kitchen was filled with wonderful aromas. Every counter was covered with dishes. I had spent nearly 2 days preparing food for the family. Even though Jennifer insisted on hosting, and even though nobody had asked me to bring a thing, I brought food anyway, because that's what mothers do. We show love through effort, through sacrifice, through the tiny details that no one notices until they're gone. Around 1 p.m., Jennifer called. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, honey. Just making sure you're still coming." "Of course." "Great. We're pretty busy on this end. See you later." Click. That was it. No asking how I was. No excitement. No warmth. Just checking a box on a to-do list. After the line went dead, I stared at my phone. The silence in the kitchen suddenly felt heavier. Years ago, Jennifer would call me 3 times while making Thanksgiving dinner. She'd ask questions, laugh, and tell stories. Now I felt like an obligation wedged into the middle of her errands. I pushed the thought away. I didn't want negativity to ruin the holiday. At 3 p.m., I loaded everything into my SUV. The pumpkin pie, the casseroles, containers of homemade cranberry sauce, serving trays, enough food for 15 people. As I carefully arranged everything, I realized something strange. I couldn't remember the last time Michael had come to see me just to visit, without needing something from me. The realization hit harder than I expected. Every single one of his recent visits involved paperwork, questions about finances, questions about the house, questions about Dad's investments. Never questions about me, my health, my happiness, or my loneliness. Just business. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, trying to shake the feeling. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe grief was making me sensitive. Maybe. But deep down, I knew things had shifted. The 1-hour drive to Jennifer's house gave me plenty of time to think. Christmas, birthdays, family vacations, soccer games, graduations. I had spent my entire adult life putting my children first. David and I worked extra shifts so they could go to good schools. We skipped vacations so they could have opportunities. We made sacrifices they would never even know about. And I would have done it all over again in a heartbeat, because that's what parents do. The problem was, somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing the sacrifice. They stopped seeing me. When I finally pulled into Jennifer's driveway, the yard was already crowded with a dozen cars. The house was glowing with warm holiday lights. Laughter drifted out from inside. For a moment, hope returned. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I was just imagining problems that weren't there. Maybe we would share memories of David. Maybe we would laugh together. Maybe we would feel like a family again. I grabbed the first casserole tray and walked up to the front door. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. No one came to open the door. No one greeted me. It was as if no one even knew I had arrived. Through the window, I could see everyone gathered inside, talking, laughing, and celebrating. Somehow, despite being invited, I suddenly felt like an outsider looking in on my own family's life. I forced a smile onto my face and reached for the doorknob. At that moment, I had absolutely no idea that before the night was over, I would uncover a secret that would shatter everything I believed about my children. And I certainly didn't know that this Thanksgiving would be the very last time I would ever sit at their table. I stood on Jennifer's front porch for a few seconds before pushing the door open myself. The sound of laughter immediately spilled out into the chilly November air. For a moment, nobody noticed me. The living room was packed with relatives, neighbors, and friends. A football game was playing on the television. Kids were running down the hallway. Someone walked past carrying a tray of drinks. The entire house felt warm and welcoming to everyone, except me. I walked in carrying the heavy casserole. "Hi, everyone," I called out. A few people glanced my way. Then they went right back to talking. No hugs, no excitement, no one saying how glad they were that I made it. Just a few polite nods. I kept my smile forced. Maybe everyone was busy. Maybe I was overthinking again. Then Jennifer finally emerged from the kitchen. "Oh, hi, Mom." She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, the kind of kiss that felt more like a duty than affection. "Need help with those?" she asked. Before I could even answer, she was already turning away. "We're running a bit behind schedule." And just like that, she disappeared back into the kitchen. I stood there alone with the casserole. For a second, I felt ridiculous, like a delivery driver who had walked into the wrong house. Eventually, I carried the dish into the kitchen myself. The counters were already overflowing with food. I carefully placed my casserole next to several store-bought deli trays. No one commented on it. No one asked what I brought. No one said thank you. I looked around the room. Brian was standing near the refrigerator talking to Michael. The moment they noticed me looking in their direction, both men went quiet. Too quiet. A strange silence passed between them. Then Michael managed to squeeze out a tight smile. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, honey. Happy Thanksgiving." "You too." That was the extent of the conversation. Within seconds, he was talking to Brian again. Only now, they were speaking in lowered voices. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just about one single moment. It was the accumulation of hundreds of tiny moments. The trivial details that kept reminding me I was no longer a part of their inner circle. I drifted toward the living room. Ashley was scrolling on her phone, barely looking up. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, Ashley. That's a lovely sweater." "Thanks." She went right back to her screen. Conversation over. Only Emma seemed genuinely happy to see me. My youngest granddaughter jumped up from the couch and threw her arms around me. "Grandma, Renee." Her smile instantly warmed my heart. "There's my favourite girl." "You always say that because it's true," she laughed. We chatted for a few minutes about school and her art class. It was the only authentic conversation I had all afternoon. Then Jennifer called Emma into the kitchen, and once again, I was entirely on my own. The house grew louder as more guests arrived. People gathered in clusters, sharing stories and refilling drinks. I wandered between rooms, searching for a place where I could fit in, a spot where I was valued, where I wasn't just taking up space. Finally, dinner was announced. Everyone moved toward the dining room. I followed behind. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I looked at the table, and my heart sank. The table had been extended to seat 12 people. Every single chair was occupied. Every place setting was meticulously arranged. But one thing was missing: my seat. For nearly 20 years, I had sat in the exact same spot every Thanksgiving, in the chair next to David. After he passed, Jennifer kept me there. It had become a tradition, a symbol of remembrance. But this year, that seat belonged to someone else. One of Brian's business partners was sitting there, laughing with another guest. I froze. Maybe there was another chair. Maybe they had rearranged the seating. Then Jennifer noticed me. "Oh, Mum." She pointed toward a small folding table near the kitchen doorway. "We set up extra seating over there." Over there. The words hit far heavier than they should have. Sitting at that tiny table were 2 young children and an elderly neighbor. It wasn't even in the dining room. It was practically in the kitchen, close enough to hear my family, but far enough away to not be a part of them. I stared at the chair, then back at Jennifer. For a brief second, I thought she might realize how incredibly hurtful this was. But she didn't. She just smiled and went back to adjusting plates. I sat down quietly. No one protested. No one offered me a spot at the main table. It seemed as though no one even noticed. From where I sat, I could see everyone laughing together. Michael was next to Jennifer. Brian was telling a story. The guests were listening intently. Meanwhile, I ate my dinner with people I barely knew. A wave of humiliation washed over me. It wasn't about the chair itself. It was about what it represented. I had spent decades building this family, creating traditions, and making holidays magical for everyone else. And now, there wasn't even a proper place for me at the table. Halfway through the meal, I decided I needed a glass of water. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. As I approached the hallway, I heard voices coming from Brian's study. The door wasn't fully closed. I instantly recognized Michael's voice. "Once we sell the house, everything becomes much simpler." I froze in my tracks. "Selling the house," Brian replied. "I know, but timing is everything. We've waited long enough." Michael sounded irritated. "Mum doesn't need that much space anyway." My heart raced. They were discussing a house. But whose house? Jennifer suddenly appeared from around the corner. The study door shut instantly. The conversation stopped. Brian and Michael walked out a few seconds later, acting completely normal. Too normal. Brian smiled. "Everything okay, Renee?" "Renee? Not Mum. Not even Mrs. Matthews. Just Renee, like I was a distant acquaintance." "Yes," I whispered. Michael avoided eye contact. The knot in my stomach tightened further. Something was wrong. I knew it. The rest of dinner passed in a complete blur. I found myself watching everyone more closely, listening more carefully, searching for clues. Every time I approached a group, the conversation shifted. Every time I walked into a room, certain topics vanished. At first I thought I was imagining things. Then it happened again and again. By the time dessert was being prepared, I felt more like an outsider crashing a private party than a member of the family. Then I noticed something else. Michael and Brian kept exchanging looks. Worried glances. The kind people give each other when they're hiding a secret. A dangerous one. I looked toward the dining room where family photos hung on the wall. One showed David standing next to me 20 years ago. Both of us smiling and proud. Back then, this family felt unbreakable. Now, I wasn't so sure. While everyone else laughed around me, a terrible thought entered my mind. What if this was no longer just about grief? What if this wasn't just about growing apart? What if they were keeping something massive from me? Something involving the house? For the first time all evening, I began to wonder if David had seen this day coming long before I did. By the time dessert was served, I was emotionally exhausted. It wasn't because Thanksgiving dinner was physically demanding, but because I had spent the entire night pretending I wasn't hurt. Pretending I hadn't noticed the missing seat. Pretending I hadn't heard Michael and Brian discussing the house. Pretending I didn't feel entirely invisible. For years I had been the one holding everyone together. The peacemaker, the organizer, the mother who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, and every important milestone. And now I was sitting quietly by the kitchen, watching everyone else enjoy the holiday I had spent decades helping to build. Jennifer was passing around pumpkin pie. The guests were praising the food. A few complimented the mashed potatoes. My mashed potatoes. The recipe David loved. The one I had spent an hour preparing that morning. No one mentioned that I had made them. No one even looked at me. I lowered my eyes, focusing on my coffee. The pain felt embarrassingly childish. I was 68 years old. Why was I still craving my children's validation? Why was I still hoping they would notice me? Maybe because no matter how old your children get, a mother never stops being a mother. Across the room, Ashley was talking to a few cousins. Emma sat next to her, scrolling through photos on her phone. For a moment, I looked at them and remembered Jennifer at that age. She used to sit right next to me during family gatherings, telling me everything. Her dreams, her fears, the boys she liked, the colleges she wanted to attend. Back then, I couldn't have imagined a day when my own daughter would look at me like a stranger. Yet, that future had arrived anyway. A burst of laughter broke my train of thought. Brian was telling another story. Everyone seemed captivated. Even Michael was laughing. I noticed something else too. Whenever the conversation drifted toward family history or David, someone would almost deliberately change the subject, as if they wanted to avoid discussing the past, or more accurately, avoid discussing something connected to it. The unease in my stomach continued to grow. Then something happened that changed everything. Ashley looked up from her phone, completely unaware of the tension in the room, and asked a simple, innocent question. Grandma doesn't know about the nursing home yet, right? The room instantly froze. All sound vanished. Forks stopped moving. Conversations ended right then and there. Even the football game on television felt miles away. I could feel my heart pounding heavily against my ribs. Ashley looked around, confused. What? Jennifer's face went entirely pale. Michael nearly dropped his coffee mug. Brian stared at the table. No one spoke. No one moved. I looked directly at Jennifer. What nursing home? My voice sounded calm. Too calm. Jennifer swallowed hard. Ashley realized immediately that she had spoken out of turn. Her eyes widened. Oh no. Jennifer, I repeated. What nursing home? My daughter forced a tight, nervous laugh. Mom, it's nothing. Nothing. That's the favorite word of people hiding secrets. I carefully set my coffee cup down. Explain it. Jennifer glanced at Michael. Michael glanced at Brian. The silent exchange lasted less than a second, but it told me everything. They had rehearsed this. Maybe not this exact conversation, but the secret itself was planned. Finally, Jennifer spoke. We were just discussing future options. But what future? Your future? I stared at her. Your future? Mom, you're getting older. There it was. The phrase every aging parent eventually dreads hearing. You're getting older. Not how are you feeling? Or do you need anything? Or are you happy? Just a reminder that your age has become someone else's problem to solve. I folded my hands in my lap. And what exactly were you discussing? Jennifer looked deeply uncomfortable. Michael stepped in. We're just worried about you. Worried? Another interesting word. What specifically are you worried about? No one answered right away. Finally, Michael said, You live alone. I've been living alone for 5 years now, and you aren't young anymore. The room remained dead silent. Every guest was pretending not to listen, which meant every guest was hanging on every word. I looked at Michael, then at Jennifer, and back to Michael. Did either of you think to ask me if I wanted to move into a facility? Neither answered, because they already knew the truth. No, I said quietly. No, you didn't. Jennifer sighed. Mom, we were just exploring possibilities. We didn't tell you because we didn't want you to be upset. The irony almost made me laugh. It wasn't the idea itself that was upsetting. It was the betrayal. Before I could respond, Emma suddenly spoke up. Grandma doesn't need a nursing home. Jennifer shot her daughter a sharp, angry glare. Emma, no, she doesn't. That's enough. Emma went quiet, but I noticed a crucial detail. The look on Jennifer's face wasn't concern. It was fear. It was as if she was desperate to make this conversation stop. The knot in my stomach tightened further. Then another detail caught my eye. On the buffet table behind, Brian set a folder. a simple blue folder left half open. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did, because I could see a signature page peeking out, and it looked familiar. Terrifyingly familiar. The handwriting looked like mine. I stood up from the table and walked toward the buffet. Brian immediately stood up. "Do you need anything, Renee?" There it was again. Not Mom, not Mrs. Matthews. Renee. I pointed toward the folder. "What's that?" His reaction was too fast, too defensive. Nothing important. He reached for the folder, but not before I caught a glimpse. His signature. My signature. Or at least something meant to look like it. My breath caught for a split second, because I knew something nobody else in that room knew. I hadn't signed a single legal document in months. Not one. Yet there my name was, written in blue ink, attached to paperwork nobody wanted me to see. Brian quickly snapped the folder shut. The movement was subtle, but it was enough. Enough to confirm my growing suspicion that something was happening behind my back. Something involving paperwork, assets, and perhaps that mysterious conversation about selling the house. I walked back to my chair, my heart racing. Conversation slowly resumed around the room. People began pretending everything was normal again, but nothing was normal anymore. I watched Jennifer laugh at something a guest said. I watched Michael avoid looking at me. I watched Brian keep the folder within arm's reach. For the first time that night, a chilling possibility entered my mind. What if this wasn't just about moving me away? What if the nursing home discussion was just a part of a much larger plan? A plan involving my finances, my property, and my future? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. The strange conversations, the missing seat, the secrecy, the discussion about selling the house, the unexplained paperwork, and that signature. Either mine, or a forged version of it. Suddenly I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt stunned, deeply stunned. Because if someone had falsified my name once, what else had they done? And who exactly was pulling the strings? Michael, Brian, Jennifer, or all three of them? As the dessert plates were cleared and laughter filled the room once more, I realized a vital truth. I wasn't sitting among family. I was sitting among people who were concealing something from me. Something big. Something hazardous. And before this night was over, I intended to find out exactly what it was. I didn't confront anyone that evening. Not because I wasn't angry, not because I wasn't hurt, and certainly not because I was afraid. I stayed quiet because a phrase David used to tell me echoed in my mind. When people think you don't know the truth, Renee, they reveal far more than they ever intended to. For 43 years, my husband had been an incredible judge of character. In that moment, I chose to follow his advice. I smiled when people looked at me. I nodded during conversations. I accepted a second piece of pie I didn't want. And through it all, I watched. I listened. I waited. The blue folder never left Brian's side. That fact alone told me everything. Whatever was inside, it mattered immensely. Around 9 p.m., guests began preparing to leave. Coats were retrieved, children grew sleepy, and goodbyes filled the house. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm. The kind of stillness that arrives only after something inside you breaks completely. Jennifer stood near the front door, thanking guests for coming. Michael was helping carry leftovers into the kitchen. Brian was talking to a neighbor. Nobody was paying attention to me. After the nursing home discussion, no one seemed interested in my feelings. It was as if the conversation had never happened, as if my future had been discussed like a football score over dessert. I stood quietly in the hallway, looking at the family photos on the wall. One from Jennifer's wedding, another from Michael's college graduation, and Christmas photos from years ago. Then my favorite, a picture of David holding Emma when she was just a baby. His smile was huge, his eyes full of love. I reached out and touched the frame. God, I missed him more than anyone knew, more than I usually allowed myself to admit. Because David would have noticed. He would have noticed if I'd been pushed to a folding table. He would have noticed if our children ignored me. He would have definitely noticed if someone was plotting behind my back. Suddenly, a wave of profound loneliness hit me. Not just because my husband was gone, but because I realized I had spent years pretending everything was fine. Pretending the growing distance between my children and me wasn't real. pretending that every ignored phone call, every forgotten visit, and every cold interaction didn't matter. Tonight had stripped away those illusions. The truth stood bare before me. I was no longer a priority in my children's lives.
Maybe I hadn't been for a very long time.
I glanced toward the kitchen. Jennifer was laughing with Brian. Michael was looking at something on his phone. Not one of them looked in my direction. Not once. I quietly walked to the coat rack, slipped my winter coat on, and buttoned it up. No one noticed. I picked up my purse. Still, no one noticed. For a moment, I stood in the middle of the room waiting. Not because I wanted to cause a scene, but because a tiny part of me hoped one of my children would look up. Maybe Jennifer would say, "Mom, are you leaving so soon?" Maybe Michael would ask, "Are you okay?" Maybe someone would walk me to my car. Maybe someone would hug me. Maybe. But no one did. The room remained full of noise, full of laughter, full of people. And yet I had never felt more invisible. I opened the front door. The cold air rushed in. Still no one looked up. I stepped outside, and the door clicked shut behind me. Just like that. No goodbye, no see you later. No one calling my name. Just silence. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, staring into the dark driveway, and then began walking toward my SUV. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was leaving Thanksgiving, but because I was leaving years of denial behind. The denial that my family still valued me the way I valued them. When I reached the car, I placed my hand on the door handle and turned around. The house was glowing warmly in the dark. From the outside, it looked beautiful. A perfect family Thanksgiving. Anyone driving by would see happiness, tradition, and togetherness. They would never guess what was happening inside. They would never guess that a mother had just spent an evening feeling utterly worthless in the family she helped build. A single tear slipped down my cheek, and I wiped it away immediately. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. I was mourning. Mourning the family I thought I had. Mourning the relationships I had spent decades protecting. And mourning the realization that love isn't always returned equally. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away. Not a single person walked out the door. Not one. The further I drove, the lighter I felt. Not happier, just clearer. The fog that had blinded my judgment for years had finally cleared. As I merged onto the interstate, I was absolutely certain of one thing. I wasn't ready to go home. Home suddenly felt different. The conversations I had overheard kept echoing in my mind. Once we sell the house. Grandma doesn't know about the nursing home yet. The mysterious paperwork. The suspicious signature. None of it made sense yet. But I intended to find out. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. For a brief second, a flicker of hope ignited. Maybe Jennifer realized I was gone. Maybe she was worried. Maybe she wanted to apologize. But the notification wasn't from Jennifer, and it wasn't from Michael. It was a promotional email. I laughed bitterly. Another 20 minutes passed. No calls, no texts, nothing. Clearly they still hadn't noticed. The realization hurt more than I cared to admit. I had been gone for nearly half an hour, and not a single person had checked on me. Not one. Then I remembered something. Months ago, an attorney named Robert Hayes had called me. He was David's longtime lawyer, and the man who had handled almost every major legal matter in our lives. At the time, Robert had said something unusual. "If you ever need me, Renee, call me anytime, day or night." I hadn't thought much of it then. Now those words rushed back. Day or night. A strange instinct took over. Instead of taking the highway toward my house, I took the exit toward downtown Columbus, toward Robert's office. The further I drove, the stronger the feeling became. David had trusted Robert completely. If something underhanded was happening, Robert would know where to start looking. By the time I reached downtown, it was nearly 10 p.m. Most of the office buildings were dark. The streets were quiet. I parked outside the small brick building and sat in the car for a moment. Part of me felt foolish, but another part felt absolutely certain. I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and stepped out into the cold night air. What I didn't know was that before this night ended, Robert Hayes would hem me something David had left behind years ago. Something that would change everything. Something my husband had prepared long before his passing. And once I opened it, there would be no turning back. The lights were still on in Robert Hayes' office. It surprised me a little. It was Thanksgiving night, close to 10 o'clock. Most people were home with their families, but Robert had never been like most people. For over 30 years, he had been more than just our attorney. He was one of David's closest friends. The two men had played golf together, argued over football, and shared countless dinners at our house. If there was one person David trusted implicitly, it was Robert. I walked through the front doors, my heart anxious. The receptionist's desk was empty, and a single lamp cast a soft glow down the hallway. Before I could even knock on Robert's office door, it swung open. He looked a bit older than the last time I'd seen him, more silver in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. But the concern on his face was immediate. Renee. His expression shifted instantly. What happened? The question alone nearly brought me to tears. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first time all day that someone had looked at me with genuine care. I forced a small smile. Happy Thanksgiving, Robert. He studied my face for a second before stepping aside. Come in. I followed him into the office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a comforting scent that felt like stepping into the past. Robert closed the door behind us. Tell me what's going on. For a few minutes, I couldn't say a word. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't know where to begin. Finally, I told him everything. The missing seat, the conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room, the discussion about the nursing home, the folder, the signature, and the talk about selling the house. Robert listened quietly, never interrupting. With every detail, his expression grew more serious. When I finished, silence filled the room.
He slowly leaned back in his chair.
This is exactly what I was afraid of. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Robert looked toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner. For the first time that night, I saw real sadness in his eyes. David prepared for this possibility. I stared at him. What possibility? That one day your children might look at you as a source of assets rather than a mother. The words felt like a physical blow. Instantly, I wanted to argue, to protect Jennifer, to defend Michael, but the reality of tonight made that impossible. Robert stood up, walked to the cabinet, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. My heart skipped a beat. On the front, in David's familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words. Only to be opened by Renee, if necessary. My breath hitched. For a second it felt as though my husband had reached through time to place a hand on my shoulder. I recognized the script immediately. The slight slant, the neat letters, the same handwriting from recipe cards and birthday notes. The script I had loved for decades. My hand shook as Robert placed the envelope in front of me. He left this with me 3 years before he passed. I couldn't take my eyes off the envelope. What is it? Robert sat back down. An emergency plan? A what? He instructed me never to give this to you unless certain conditions were met. I looked up. What conditions? Robert hesitated before answering quietly. If your children ever attempted to manipulate, isolate, or pressure you regarding property, a tightness gripped my chest. The idea that David had foreseen this years before his death felt impossible. Yet here it was. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several legal documents, and a thumb drive. The letter was on top. I unfolded the paper, and the moment I saw the first line, my eyes welled with tears. My dearest Renee, if you are reading this, then something has happened that I hoped never would. I had to pause. David's voice felt alive in every word. Robert turned away politely, granting me space. I read on. You know better than anyone how much I love our children. Everything I did in life was for you and for them. But love should never blind us to reality. Over the last few years, I've noticed changes. Small things. Conversations about money, questions about ownership, inquiries about inheritance. They happened far too often to be about your well-being. I pray I am wrong. I pray this letter is never opened. But if it is, I need you to know one vital thing. None of this is your fault. A tear fell onto the page. I kept reading. You have always believed the best in people. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But it can also make you vulnerable to those who mistake kindness for weakness. If anyone pressures you regarding property, finances, or your future, do not compromise out of guilt. Protect yourself. Protect your peace. protect the life we built together. My hands were trembling now. Every word felt like David was sitting right beside me, speaking directly to me. The next paragraph changed everything. Most importantly, there are aspects of our assets that only Robert fully understands. I deliberately designed certain safeguards to ensure no one can force you into decisions that aren't in your best interest. Trust Robert. Trust the documents attached. Trust yourself. You are far stronger than you realize. Love always, David. By the time I reached the signature, I was crying openly. Not a dramatic sob, just silent tears. The kind born from a mix of grief and profound love. Robert handed me a tissue. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I looked at the legal documents inside the envelope. What are these? Robert took a slow breath. The safeguards David mentioned. I wiped my eyes. What kind of safeguards? He opened a folder. Several things. The seriousness in his voice caught my attention immediately. Before passing, David restructured certain parts of your estate. I frowned. Our estate? Yes. Robert pointed to the paperwork. He wanted to ensure that no transfer of assets could be forced without your direct authorization and multiple legal reviews. A strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like an awakening. For years I had assumed David's estate planning was straightforward. Clearly it wasn't. Clearly he had anticipated risks I had never even considered. Why would he do that? Robert looked straight at me. Because he saw things. What things? He hesitated, then answered carefully. Years ago, Michael began asking highly detailed questions about property ownership. I stared at him. Michael? Robert nodded. And there were concerns involving Brian as well. The room suddenly felt much colder. Concerns. Financial concerns. I recalled Brian's tense demeanor from earlier tonight. The folder, the secrecy, the constant whispering. Suddenly, it all felt connected. Incomplete, but chilling nonetheless. I leaned back, trying to process it all. The Thanksgiving dinner, the nursing home discussion, the forged signature, David's letter, the safeguards, the warnings, everything. Then a thought hit me, a terrifying one. What if they're already moving forward? Robert's expression turned somber. That is exactly what we need to find out. For the first time that night, I realized this was no longer just a family conflict. It was a potential conspiracy involving deception, legal documents, and the very things David had tried to protect me from years before his death. And as Robert reached for another file on his desk, I had a feeling the worst of the truth was yet to come. For several minutes after Robert spoke, neither of us said a word. The office was incredibly quiet. Outside, Thanksgiving night continued as it always did. Families gathered around fireplaces, children played with cousins, and people laughed over leftovers and football. Meanwhile, I sat across from my attorney, wondering if my own children were plotting behind my back. It felt surreal. A part of me still hoped it was a misunderstanding, a logical explanation, an error, but another part remembered the look on Jennifer's face when Ashley brought up the nursing home. The panic, the fear, the guilt. That was not the reaction of an innocent person. Robert finally broke the silence. What do you plan to do tonight? I looked down at David's letter. I don't know. Do you feel safe going home? The question caught me off guard. Safe? I have to ask.
I thought about it. Truthfully, I didn't fear physical danger. My children wouldn't harm me physically. But emotionally, that was a different story.
I'm not sure. Robert nodded slowly. As a precaution, I recommend waiting until we know more. The gravity in his voice was unsettling. Before I could respond, my phone suddenly buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Jennifer. My stomach tightened. The phone continued to ring. For a brief second, I considered answering. Then I noticed the time. 11:17 p.m. I had been gone for nearly 2 hours. 2 hours. And they were only just noticing. I muted the call.
Seconds later, another call came in. Michael. Then another from Jennifer. Robert watched quietly.
They finally realized you're missing. I stared at the screen, a bitter sadness settling into my heart. Not because they were calling, but because it had taken so long. I pictured the scene at Jennifer's house. Guests leaving, dishes being washed, conversations winding down, and finally someone asking, "Where's Mom?" Only to realize I had vanished. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Jennifer. "Mum, where are you?" Immediately followed by another. "Please call me." Then came Michael's. "We need to talk." Need, not want. Need. The distinction wasn't lost on me. Over the years, I had watched my son become increasingly selective with his communication. He called when he needed something. When he didn't, weeks could pass without a word. Tonight felt no different, except the stakes had changed. I placed the phone face down on the desk. Robert remained silent, not needing to say what we were both thinking. The timing itself spoke volumes. Another message arrived, then another, and another. The phone vibrated continuously. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened Jennifer's latest text. "Mum, please pick up. We're worried." Worried? The word felt foreign. Had they been worried when they discussed a nursing home without me? Had they been worried when they hid the documents? Had they been worried when they relegated me to a folding table? I wasn't so sure. A new message popped up, this time from Brian. "Renee, call us immediately." I narrowed my eyes. Not Mom, not Mrs. Matthews. Renee. Even in a crisis, he couldn't bring himself to address me as family. Robert noticed my expression. "What is it?" I handed him the phone. He read the message and handed it back slowly. "Interesting. That's one way to put it." My phone rang again. This time, Michael left a voicemail. A minute later, another arrived, then a third. The urgency was escalating quickly. I played the first message. "Hey, Mom, give me a call when you get this." His voice sounded calm, almost casual. The second voicemail arrived 20 minutes later, and the difference was stark. "Mom, seriously, call us back." The third sounded entirely different. There was tension now, frustration, and perhaps fear. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk tonight."
Need to talk. Need again. Always need, never love, never missing me, never, how are you?
Robert crossed his hands. "Did you notice the shift?" I nodded. "They sound frantic."
Exactly.
A chill passed through me. Something about their reaction felt wrong. If they were simply concerned for my safety, the messages would sound different. Instead, they sounded increasingly desperate, as if something crucial depended on finding me. And quickly. My phone rang once more. Brian. I ignored it. Immediately after, a text appeared. "Please call. The paperwork needs to be discussed."
I froze. Paperwork. The word they hadn't intended to speak aloud had appeared. I showed Robert, and his jaw tightened. Sloppy.
I stared at the screen. Paperwork. Not, "Are you safe?" Not, "We're worried." Not, "We love you." Paperwork. The message was deleted by Brian just seconds later, but not before I had seen it. And not before I had taken a screenshot.
Robert actually smiled. "Good. You think that's important?"
Extremely. For the first time that night, I saw a look of near certainty in his eyes. Whatever was happening, the pieces were beginning to emerge. The masks were slipping. Meanwhile, my family seemed to be unraveling. Just after midnight, another call came in, this time from Emma. I answered immediately. "Oh, Grandma." Her voice sounded scared. "Hi, sweetheart." "Oh, thank goodness." My heart softened instantly. Unlike everyone else, Emma sounded genuinely concerned. Not anxious, not desperate. Concerned. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Everyone is looking for you." I hesitated. "Everyone?" She lowered her voice. "Uncle Michael and Mom have been arguing." I frowned. "About what?" "I'm not sure." A pause. Then she whispered, "Actually, I think I do." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" "They keep talking about a signature." I looked at Robert, and his expression instantly darkened. Signature. Paperwork. A cold sensation settled deep in my chest. Emma continued. I wasn't supposed to hear. "What else did they say?" Another pause. Then, Uncle Michael said, "If they don't find you soon, the deal can't go through." The deal, not family, not care. A deal. I closed my eyes. The words hit harder than I expected, because deep down, I already knew what it meant. The calls, the panic, the sudden urgency. It wasn't about me. It was about something they needed from me. Something they thought they already controlled. And now that I was missing, their plans were suddenly in jeopardy. Emma's voice trembled. "Grandma, I'm here. Are you coming back?" I swallowed hard. The question carried more weight than she could possibly know, because for the first time in my life, I truly didn't know the answer. Not back to Jennifer's house. Not back to the role I had always played. and not back to the woman who sacrificed everything, only to be given less and less in return. I don't know yet, sweetheart. Silence fell on her end. Then she said something that nearly broke my heart. I miss you already. Tears filled my eyes because after hours of manipulation, lies, and suspicion, that one honest phrase felt monumental. I love you, Emma. I love you too. After the line went dead, the silence returned. Robert leaned back in his chair. We didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, They aren't looking for you because you left. I stared at David's letter on the desk. No, I know that now. Robert nodded. They're looking for you because whatever they have planned can't happen without you. As my phone continued to vibrate with calls from Jennifer, Michael, and Brian, I realized a painful truth. For the first time in my life, my absence had become valuable to them. Not because they missed me, but because they needed something only I could provide. And whatever that something was, I began to suspect it involved far more than a simple house. I didn't go home that night. On Robert's advice, I stayed at a small hotel near downtown Columbus. Not because I was hiding, but because I needed time to think. Time to process everything that had happened in less than 24 hours. The ignored Thanksgiving dinner, the nursing home discussion, the suspicious paperwork, David's letter, the desperate calls, and the deal Emma revealed that couldn't happen without me. Sleep came in brief, fitful fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's handwriting. Protect yourself. Protect your peace. Protect the life we built together. By 6:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from Robert once again. The holiday weekend was just beginning, but neither of us wanted to wait. Something was in motion, and we both knew it. Robert arrived with several folders, a serious expression on his face. The kind a lawyer wears when preparing to deliver bad news.
Did you sleep?
Not much. I figured. He sat down and opened one of the files. There's someone I want you to meet. Before I could ask who, the office door opened, and a tall man in his early 50s walked in. Short brown hair, calm eyes, and a professional posture. The kind of man who noticed everything around him instantly. Renee, this is Daniel Brooks. The man extended his hand. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Matthews. I shook it. Likewise. Robert pointed to a chair. Daniel's a private investigator.
That caught my attention immediately. I looked from Daniel to Robert and back again. A private investigator.
Daniel nodded. Yes. A knot formed in my stomach, unsure if I liked where this conversation was heading. Robert folded his hands. A few months ago, before Thanksgiving, you contacted me with some concerns. I frowned. I remember. At the time, my worries had felt vague and difficult to explain. Small things, uncomfortable feelings, strange comments from Michael about assets and ownership. The questions seemed increasingly focused on assets rather than family. There was no hard evidence, just intuition. Robert continued. Based on those concerns, I recommended Daniel. My eyes widened as I remembered the phone call, the meeting, the conversation I had nearly forgotten. Back in August, I had quietly agreed to let Daniel look into a few things. At the time, I felt guilty, even paranoid. I had almost cancelled the arrangement twice. Now I was incredibly glad I hadn't. Daniel opened a document. What I'm about to show you isn't pleasant. The room suddenly felt colder. I'd rather know the truth. He nodded. Usually that's the right answer. The first document slid across the desk, a printed email. I recognized Michael's name instantly, and my heart rate spiked. What is this? Daniel pointed to a screenshot attached to the report. This is correspondence legally obtained through public records, corporate disclosures, and other investigative methods. I began to read, and halfway down the first page, my heart sank. The exchange involved Michael and Brian. The subject, my house. Not their house, my house. There it was in black and white, estimated market value, potential sale price, and projected proceeds. I looked up, momentarily unable to speak. Daniel continued calmly. Those conversations began roughly 8 months ago. 8 months. I stared at him. 8 months. Yes, the realization hit hard. And while I was still calling my children, sending birthday cards, and inviting them to dinner, they had been discussing my property for months. Daniel pushed another document toward me. This one contained messages between Brian and an unnamed real estate consultant. The phrasing made my skin crawl. Once Renee transitions to an assisted living facility, the process becomes much easier. Transitions. Not moves, not chooses. Transitions. As if my life were simply a logistical hurdle. As if I were inventory. I pushed the paper away, my hands shaking. Daniel gave me a moment before continuing. There's more. Of course, there was more. There was always more. The next document revealed records of multiple meetings. Michael, Brian, a financial advisor, and a real estate specialist. Several conversations focused on timing, strategy, and paperwork. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Asset control. I felt physically sick. Robert noticed immediately. You don't have to keep looking. No, I said firmly. I need to see it. If my family had been orchestrating something, I needed to see the full extent of it, no matter how painful. Daniel nodded respectfully and opened another folder. This one contained something different. Photographs, surveillance images, and logs. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but together they told a story. A narrative that had unfolded behind my back. One photo showed Michael and Brian meeting outside a title company. Another showed them entering a law firm. A third showed them speaking with a real estate agent. The dates traced back nearly a year. Nearly a year? I couldn't stop thinking about that. While I was mourning David, adjusting to living alone, and trying to keep family traditions alive, they had apparently been developing a plan. A long-term plan. Daniel set the photos aside and looked at me directly. Mrs. Matthews, I need to ask you something. What? Have you signed any documents transferring ownership of your home? No. Any power of attorney forms?
No.
Any authorization paperwork? No. Daniel nodded. To the best of our knowledge, that is accurate. The phrasing caught my attention. To the best of our knowledge. More than a simple yes, it implied something else. Robert and Daniel exchanged a look, one I noticed immediately. My stomach tightened again. What is it? Daniel hesitated, then slid the final document across the table. I looked down, and it felt like all the air had been kicked out of my lungs. It was a copy of a signature page, and my name appeared at the bottom. Renee Matthews. The signature looked remarkably convincing. Almost perfect. Almost, but not quite. Because I knew my own handwriting, and that signature was not mine. I stared at it, unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to fully process what I was looking at. Daniel finally broke the silence. We believe this signature may be fraudulent. The room went completely still. A fraudulent signature. Not a misunderstanding, not speculation, not hurt feelings. A forged signature. A potential crime. I closed my eyes. A part of me wanted to deny it, to insist there must be another explanation. But I remembered the folder from Thanksgiving. I remembered Brian's movement to hide it. I remembered the panic, the secrecy, the whispering, and the fear. Suddenly it all made sense, or at least more sense than it ever had before. What document is this attached to? Daniel answered immediately. A preliminary authorization related to property transactions. My heart raced. Property transactions? Yes. Robert leaned forward. This is why your disappearance last night caused a panic. I looked at him. What do you mean? Because if the transaction moves forward, additional signatures will eventually be required. The pieces finally aligned. The frantic calls, the desperate messages, the urgency. It had never been about Thanksgiving. It had never been about family. It had never been about me. It was about a transaction, a timeline, a schedule. And suddenly, I wasn't cooperating. Daniel closed the file. There is one more thing.
I braced myself. What?
His expression grew even more serious. The investigation suggests this isn't just Michael acting alone. Before he even spoke, I knew the answer. Brian. Daniel nodded. From what we can tell, Brian appears to be the primary driving force. The room fell quiet. I thought back to Thanksgiving. The missing chair, the false concern, the hidden folder, the constant whispering. Brian at the center of it all, and for the first time in my life, a new emotion emerged. Not sadness, not grief, anger. A cold, clear, righteous anger. Because whatever mistakes my children were making, someone was guiding them there. Someone had convinced them that I was an obstacle rather than a mother. As I stared at that signature with my name falsified, I realized an important truth. The woman who had walked out of Thanksgiving dinner was not the same woman sitting in Robert's office now. The old Renee would have doubted herself. The new Renee wanted answers, and she intended to get every single one of them. For most of my life, I believed that knowledge brought comfort. If you knew the truth, you could handle it. But over that weekend, I learned something different. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. Sometimes it shatters illusions you never expected to lose. The fraudulent signature lay on Robert's desk between us. A simple piece of paper, yet it represented something massive. Not just deception, but betrayal. Because strangers had never treated me this way. My own family had done this. I stared at the document for a long time, trying to connect it to the children I had raised. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. The little girl who would climb into my bed after a nightmare. How had we reached this point? How had property become more important than trust? Eventually, I pushed the question away. There would be time for grief later. Right now, I needed facts. Robert seemed to sense the shift in my thinking. Good. I looked up. What? The way you're sitting. I frowned. What do you mean? You're no longer reacting emotionally. I glanced at the folders spread across the conference table. Maybe he was right. For the first 24 hours, I had mostly felt shock. Now, something else was taking over. Clarity. The kind of clarity David always seemed to have in difficult situations. Tell me everything, I said. Robert nodded and opened another file. Let's start with ownership. Ownership. The word suddenly felt incredibly significant. He pulled out several documents, property records, trust agreements, investment summaries, and deeds. Papers I had either forgotten existed or had never fully understood. David had always handled the complex financial matters. Not because I was incapable, but because that was how we divided our life. He managed the investments, and I managed the day-to-day. It was a pattern that worked for decades. Apparently, he had been planning for the long term as well. Robert pointed to the first document, the family home. I recognized the address instantly. The house David and I had lived in for 36 years. The place where we raised Jennifer and Michael. The house everyone seemed so interested in. What about it? Robert pushed the deed toward me. Whose name is listed? I looked closely, then looked again, my eyes widening. Only one name appeared. Renee Matthews. Not David. Not David's estate. Not Michael. Not Jennifer. Mine. Mine alone. Wait, I looked up. I thought David and I owned it jointly. Initially, yes. Robert nodded. A few years before he passed, David transferred full ownership to you. I blinked. I don't remember that. You signed the paperwork. I searched my memory and slowly recalled the meeting. A stack of papers, a conversation about estate planning. At the time, I hadn't paid close attention because I trusted David completely. Clearly, I should have listened more carefully. Robert tapped the page. The house belongs entirely to you. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't relief, it was empowering. For the first time, I understood why certain people were so interested in my future. I wasn't just an aging widow. I was the legal owner of a highly valuable piece of real estate, and they knew it. Robert opened another folder. There's more. There was always more. He displayed documents related to a lakeside cabin, and my eyes widened again. The cabin. Robert smiled faintly. You remember? Barely. Years ago, David had bought a small cabin a few hours away. We used it occasionally for weekends. Fishing, reading, escaping the city. After he died, I had almost forgotten it existed. The cabin is yours too. I shook my head slowly, entirely in my name.
My mind flashed back to Thanksgiving, to the conversation I had overheard. Once we sell the house.
Now, I wasn't sure which house they meant. Maybe they wanted both. The family home, the cabin, anything they could access. Robert continued. Then there are the investment accounts. My stomach tightened. Money had never interested me much. Security and independence did. But numbers on a statement rarely excited me. Today felt different. Today, those numbers represented freedom. Freedom from manipulation, freedom from pressure, and freedom from the people who viewed me as a transaction. Robert handed me another report, and the balance was far larger than I anticipated. Far larger. I stared at it. David never told me. He didn't want you worrying about finances. That sounded exactly like David. Overly protective. Always quietly carrying the heavy lifting. Always making life easier for everyone else. Even after he was gone. Robert pointed to several legal clauses. These assets are protected through a structure David established years ago. I studied the paperwork. Most of it looked complicated, but one detail caught my eye immediately: the requirement for multiple approvals, additional reviews, and protective restrictions. Obstacles. David hadn't just organized our finances, he had built walls around them, walls designed to protect me. The realization brought tears to my eyes. Even now, years after his passing, he was still looking out for me. Robert gave me a moment before continuing. The most important thing you need to understand is this. I looked up. No one can legally force you to transfer these assets. The words carried an unexpected weight. No one. Not Michael, not Jennifer, not Brian. No one. For months, maybe years, I had unconsciously assumed my children held some sort of authority over my future. Now I knew the truth. They didn't. The only authority they possessed was the authority I gave them. And that realization changed something deep inside me. Daniel walked back into the room with additional paperwork. Excuse me. He placed another folder on the table. What's this? More information on Brian? The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even before opening the file, I suspected what we would find. Debt. The answers appeared on the very first page. Massive obligations, credit liabilities, business losses, personal loans, and overdue payments. I stared in disbelief. The numbers were staggering, far worse than I had imagined. Daniel spoke carefully. We believe these financial pressures explain much of his behavior. Explain, not excuse. There was a difference, a very important difference. I studied the report, and suddenly the puzzle pieces fell into place. The urgency, the secrecy, the meetings, the pressure, the discussions about property. A desperate man facing severe financial crisis could convince himself almost anything was justified, even exploiting family, especially if the payout seemed large enough. Robert crossed his arms. Do you see now why they panicked when you disappeared?
I nodded slowly. For the first time, I truly understood. My absence wasn't emotional, it was logistical. Their plan depended on access. Access depended on cooperation, and cooperation depended on me. And I was no longer cooperating.
I thought about all the calls, all the texts, all the sudden concern. The realization was heartbreaking, yet strangely liberating. Because once you stop believing a lie, it loses its power over you. My phone buzzed again. Jennifer. Still calling, still looking, still desperate. I stared at her name on the screen and muted it. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. For years, the moment my children needed me, I responded instantly, dropping everything, fixing problems, offering help, making sacrifices. This time was different. This time, I would know the full truth before deciding what happened next. David's letter lay beside me, and the final line echoed in my mind. Trust yourself. You are far stronger than you realize. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I believed he might be right. Because the frightened woman who had left Jennifer's house was gone. In her place was a woman who finally understood one vital thing. The house was never theirs. The assets were never theirs. And the future was never theirs to control. And before this was over, everyone involved was going to learn that lesson, including me. The first thing I did on Monday morning was call the bank. Not Jennifer, not Michael, not Brian. The bank. 3 days ago, the decision would have felt extreme. Now, it felt necessary. By then, I had spent nearly 48 hours reviewing documents with Robert and Daniel. Every hour seemed to uncover another unsettling truth. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic enough for a television crime show, but a steady accumulation of facts I could no longer ignore. My family was planning around me, not with me, and I was tired of being the last person to know about my own life. I sat in Robert's conference room while a representative from my primary financial institution joined us on speakerphone. The woman introduced herself politely, verified my identity, and asked how she could help. I glanced at Robert, and he gave a small nod. I'd like a complete audit of everyone who has access to any of my accounts. The representative paused briefly. Of course. A few minutes later, she began listing information. Most of it was expected. Checking accounts, savings accounts, investment relationships, automatic transfers. Then she reached a section that made my stomach tighten. There are several authorized secondary access points. I sat up straighter. Secondary access points. Yes, My gaze shifted to Robert, who was listed. The representative began reading the names. The first wasn't a surprise. David. It was an old authorization still on file. The second name caught me completely off guard. Michael Matthews. I closed my eyes slowly and carefully. Please explain exactly what that means. The representative explained. The access wasn't ownership, not full control, but it granted visibility, information. The ability to view certain financial details, enough to monitor balances, enough to know far more than I realized he did. When was this established? The representative checked. Roughly 4 years ago. 4 years ago. I flashed back immediately to that time. David was sick then, and Michael had offered to help manage the paperwork. At the time, it had felt harmless, even responsible. I never dreamed it would become something else. Remove his access. The representative didn't hesitate. Of course, a strange sensation flowed through me. Not revenge, not satisfaction, but something healthier. Boundaries. For perhaps the first time in years, I was establishing boundaries. After the call ended, Robert smiled faintly. How does that feel? I thought about it for a moment. Later. And it did. Every step felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. The next few hours followed a similar pattern. Financial institutions, legal reviews, document updates, and authorization changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just practical decisions. Yet every single one mattered because every decision sent the same message. My life belongs to me. By late afternoon, my phone rang again. Jennifer. I stared at the screen and let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call arrived. Michael. Then Brian. I ignored them all, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wasn't ready. The truth was, every time I saw their names, conflicting emotions surfaced. Love, anger, disappointment, sadness. A mother doesn't easily stop loving her children at 68, even when they hurt her, even when they betray her. That's why betrayal is so painful. It has a deep place to land. My phone vibrated with a notification for a voicemail, then another, and another. Finally, curiosity won, and I played Jennifer's message first.
Mom, please call me back. Her voice sounded tight. We need to talk. Need, not want. Need.
I switched to Michael's message. Mom, this situation is getting out of hand. An interesting choice of words. Not heartbreaking, not emotional, but administrative, like a project facing complications. Then I listened to Brian's. That one caught my attention immediately. Renee, there's been a misunderstanding that needs to be cleared up.
Misunderstanding. I nearly laughed out loud. A forged signature isn't a misunderstanding. Secret meetings aren't a misunderstanding. Discussions about a nursing home aren't a misunderstanding. They are choices, conscious decisions made by someone.
Later that evening, Daniel called, his voice carrying an energy I hadn't heard before. Are you sitting down? I instantly became alert. Why? I found something. The words sent a chill through me. What? A paper trail. I glanced at Robert, who was across the room, reviewing files. I put the call on speakerphone. Daniel continued, Brian's financial difficulties are much worse than we initially thought. I wasn't surprised, but what he said next completely caught me off guard. There are business loans. Okay. Personal loans. Okay. And a second mortgage.
I frowned. On Jennifer's house?
Yes. The room went completely silent. A second mortgage. I had no idea. Clearly Jennifer hadn't discussed it either. Daniel continued. Some of the debt seems to be tied to failed investment projects. The picture became clear. Painfully clear. Brian wasn't just greedy. He was desperate. And desperate people often convince themselves that unethical decisions are temporary, necessary, and justified, right up until those decisions destroy everything. What does this have to do with me? I already guessed the answer. Daniel confirmed it anyway. The value of your assets could resolve most of their problems. There it was. The phrase nobody wanted to say out loud. My assets, not me. My assets. The distinction mattered because it was the first time I clearly saw the motive hiding behind everything. It wasn't concern. It wasn't a family plan. It was money. A heavy sadness washed over me. I thought back to all the Thanksgiving conversations, the whispers, the looks, and the hidden documents. Every single road seemed to lead to the exact same destination. Money. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a few minutes. Finally, Robert spoke. "You're mourning." I looked up.
Or mourning the image of the family you thought you had.
His words carried an uncomfortable accuracy, because that was exactly what I was doing. Facts hurt, but they don't hurt nearly as much as the collapse of a belief system. The belief that family always acts out of love. The belief that there is good intention behind every mistake. The belief that loyalty naturally follows sacrifice. Life isn't that simple. People are complex, even the ones we love. Especially the ones we love. As night fell, I made one final decision. Perhaps the most important one so far. I called my insurance company, then my lawyer, and then several institutions connected to David's estate planning. One by one, I updated records, verified safeguards, added protections, and reinforced the barriers. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just prudent management. By the time I finished, any pathway for someone to transfer assets without my direct involvement was effectively gone. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt safe. Not physically, but financially, legally, and emotionally. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Jennifer, Michael, or Brian. It was Emma. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma." Her voice sounded incredibly relieved. "Yes, I hoped you'd pick up." I smiled. "I will always answer your calls." There was a brief silence, and then she revealed something unexpected. "Mom and Dad are fighting." I exchanged a look with Robert. "About what?" "I think it's money." Money again. Always money. Emma hesitated, then lowered her voice. I heard Dad say, "Everything is ruined?" I narrowed my eyes. Everything. Not Thanksgiving, not family relationships. Everything. A plan. A strategy. Something much larger than I had initially imagined. When the call ended, I found myself staring out the office window. The sun was setting, and the city lights were starting to flicker. For the first time in my life, I realized a vital truth. Thanksgiving didn't destroy my family. It just exposed it. The masks were slipping. The lies were unyielding. Beneath all the excuses and manipulation, the true motives had finally come into view. The question now wasn't whether they had a plan. The evidence already answered that. The question was how far they were willing to go, and whether they understood that I was no longer the woman they thought they could control. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I went missing. At least that's what my family thought. The truth wasn't nearly as dramatic. I didn't vanish into thin air. I just stopped being available. For years, my life had been an open door. Anyone could call, anyone could visit, anyone could demand my time, my help, and my attention, and I always said yes. Now that door was shut. Not locked forever, just closed long enough for me to catch my breath. Long enough for me to think. Long enough for me to remember who I was before I became everyone else's solution. That's why on a cold December morning, I found myself driving north along winding roads. The destination was nearly a 3-hour drive away, a small cabin hidden by the lake. It was a place David loved deeply, a place most people, including myself, had nearly forgotten about. The cabin appeared through the trees around noon, a modest structure of weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a wide front porch. Nothing luxurious, nothing conspicuous. Yet, the moment I saw it, my chest tightened. Memories came rushing back. Weekend fishing trips, quiet mornings, drinking coffee with David, walking along the water, conversations about retirement, and dreams of growing old together. Dreams that were never fully realized. I parked my SUV and sat quietly for a few minutes. The lake glistened under a pale winter sky. Snow covered the shoreline. The entire place felt untouched by chaos, untouched by betrayal, untouched by the things left behind in Ohio. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something resembling peace. Inside, the cabin looked exactly as I remembered. David's fishing rod still hung in the corner. A few old photographs still sat on the shelves. A stack of books rested by the fireplace. Inside one of the books was David's bookmark. I carefully picked it up. It was a hardware store receipt, 3 years old. Somehow that tiny detail nearly made me cry. That's how grief works. Sometimes it's not the big things. Sometimes it's a forgotten receipt, a coffee mug, a jacket hanging in a closet, the evidence of an ordinary life. I spent the afternoon unpacking, building a fire, making tea, and watching the snow drift across the lake. For the first time in years, nobody needed me to do anything. Nobody expected anything from me. The silence felt strange at first, then comforting, and then indispensable. That night, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Jennifer, Michael, Brian. The pattern continued. Calls, texts, voicemails. I ignored them all, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wasn't ready to hear their explanations. Explanations usually appear after people get caught. The truth appears before that. There is a difference. Around 7 p.m., another call came in. Emma, I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Her relief was unmistakable. Oh, thank goodness. Are you okay? I've been so worried. Unlike everyone else, she sounded sincere. No agenda, no hidden motives, just care. The kind of care family is supposed to show. I'm fine. Where are you? I smiled. In a quiet place. She laughed softly. That sounds wonderful. Yes, it is. After a pause, her voice dropped. Things are really bad at home. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? Everyone is fighting. I wasn't surprised, not anymore. About what? Mostly about you. I stared at the fire in the fireplace. Me? Dad keeps fighting with Mom. The words caught my attention immediately. Brian and Jennifer at the center of it all. What are they fighting about? Emma hesitated, then answered carefully. Money. That word again. Always about money. I felt a wave of sadness because every new discovery seemed to lead to the exact same place. Not care, not love. Money. Emma continued. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I know. But I heard Dad yelling. My stomach tightened. What did he say? Another pause. He said everything was supposed to be finished by now.
Finished. The word lingered in my mind. Finished. As if a process had been interrupted. As if a plan had been delayed.
What else did he say? He said you ruined everything. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because the words were hurtful, but because they confirmed something. A person doesn't say, you ruined everything, unless they were expecting something specific to happen. Something valuable. Something important. And now that thing was gone. Emma's voice trembled. I'm sorry, Grandma. None of this is your fault.
I know, sweetheart. But she didn't sound convinced. Like many children, she carried a burden that wasn't hers to bear.
I changed the subject, asking about school, her drawings, her friends, normal things. For a few minutes, the conversation felt wonderfully ordinary. Then she said something unexpected. There's one more thing. The seriousness in her tone caught my attention immediately. What is it? I think you need to know. I leaned forward. The fire crackled beside me. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, my heart rate quickened. What happened? Emma took a deep breath. Last week, before Thanksgiving, Mom and Dad had someone over to the house. I listened intently. Who? I don't know. Okay. They were talking in Dad's study. My heart quickened. The study. The exact room where I had overheard the conversation on Thanksgiving Day. The room where all the secrets seemed to gather. I didn't mean to listen. Another apology from a child caught between loyalty and the truth. It's okay. I heard Uncle Michael's voice, too. That got my attention immediately. What were they discussing? Emma lowered her voice. The house. I wasn't surprised, but I kept quiet to let her continue. They kept mentioning your name. A chill passed through me. They said once everything was signed, things would be much easier. Signed? That word again. Signatures, paperwork, approvals. Everything connected back to the same place. The forged signature, the property discussions, the desperation. Then Emma said something that changed everything. I recorded part of it. The room seemed to stand still. I thought I misheard her. What? I recorded part of the conversation. I sat motionless. You did? It was an accident. I was recording a video for a friend. She sounded nervous. I didn't know it was this important.
The fire gave a loud pop. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, do you still have it?
Yes. My mind raced. A recording. Not a rumor, not a hypothesis. A recording. Actual evidence. Something concrete. Something real. I can send it to you. I looked at the empty seat beside me, just staring at the flames. Because suddenly, the situation felt different. Not emotionally, but strategically. Up until now, most of what we found came from documents and investigations. Useful, important, but circumstantial. A recording could be something entirely different. A window into the truth. Raw, unfiltered. Would you be willing to send it to me? Of course. I smiled sadly. Thank you, sweetheart. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Outside, the lake had disappeared into the darkness. The cabin remained warm, safe, and peaceful. Yet my mind was racing. Emma, the recording, the conversation, the house, the signature, the plan. Every road seemed to converge toward a single point: the truth. For the first time in my life, I suspected that the evidence my family feared most wasn't hidden in bank records or legal files. It might just exist on a teenager's phone, waiting to reveal exactly what they said when they thought nobody was listening. The video arrived the next morning. I stared at the notification on my phone for a full minute before tapping it. Not because I didn't understand the technology, but because I was afraid of what I would hear. Some truths are much easier to suspect than to confirm. The file wasn't long, less than 7 minutes, but those 7 minutes would permanently alter the way I viewed my family. I immediately forwarded it to Robert and then to Daniel. Within an hour, the three of us were sitting together in Robert's office. The video was right in front of us on a laptop. Nobody spoke. Finally, Robert pressed play. The image was shaky, clearly recorded unintentionally at first. The camera pointed at the floor, with furniture occasionally appearing in the frame. Voices drifted in from another room. It was exactly the study Emma had described. The recording began with ordinary chatter, background noise, and the sound of people moving around. Then a familiar voice appeared. "Michael, we can't wait forever." My stomach tightened. Brian answered immediately. "I know." The room was dead silent as we listened. The conversation continued. There was no context, no introduction. Just people speaking freely because they believed no one important was listening. Michael sounded frustrated. "She won't do it willingly." Willingly. An interesting choice of words. Not agree, not choose. Willingly. As if my lack of cooperation were the problem. Brian sighed. "So we need another way." Another way. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. Robert paused the video. For a moment nobody spoke. Then he resumed playback, and Jennifer's voice joined the conversation. "I don't like this." For the first time in weeks, I felt an unexpected emotion. Relief. Maybe Jennifer had opposed it all. Maybe she had tried to stop it.
Maybe.
But the next sentence shattered that hope. "I just don't want her to find out. Not, I don't want to do this. Not, this is wrong. Not, stop." She didn't object to the plan. She objected to being caught. My chest tightened.
The video continued, and Brian spoke next. "Once the paperwork is processed, none of this will matter."
The room became incredibly quiet. Paperwork again. Always paperwork. Always documents. Always signatures. Robert paused the recording once more. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Neither man looked surprised, only disappointed. I understood why. This evidence wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was real. People speaking honestly. People revealing their true nature. The video resumed, and seconds later the phrase that changed everything appeared. Michael laughed softly and said, "If we can show she's confused, things become much easier." The phrase felt as if it sucked all the air out of the room. Confused air. Not aging, not vulnerable. Confused. A legal term. A strategic term. A dangerous term. I stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to blink, unable to fully digest the words I had just heard. Robert paused the video again. The office was filled with silence. Finally I spoke. "What does that mean?" His answer came immediately. "It means they are discussing your competency." My heart sank. Legal capacity. Mental capacity. The ability to make decisions. The ability to control property. The ability to say no. Everything suddenly made sense. The nursing home discussion, the secret meetings, the forged signature, the pressure, the urgency. They weren't just trying to influence me. They were discussing how to completely strip away my rights. Daniel leaned forward. "The phrasing is deeply concerning."
Deeply concerning. An investigator's warning.
Robert kept playing the video, and the conversation grew worse. Jennifer sounded nervous. "What if she refuses?" Brian answered immediately. "Then we have to accelerate the timeline." Accelerate the timeline. Not to reconsider. Not stop. Accelerate. The confidence in his voice chilled me because it indicated planning, preparation, and momentum. This wasn't a spontaneous discussion. It was a strategy already in motion. Then another voice came through, Michael again. "Once the house is sold, most of the problems disappear." There it was. The house. The center of everything. All these conversations seemed to revolve around this single goal, a goal deemed worthy of sacrificing relationships, manipulating family, lying, and betraying a mother. The video ended shortly after. There were no dramatic confessions, no criminal mastermind speeches. Just ordinary people discussing extreme selfishness. Somehow that made it hurt even more. When the screen went black, nobody moved. For several seconds, all I could hear was the faint hum of the laptop. Finally, Robert closed it. All right, a single word, yet it carried immense weight. Daniel broke the silence first. This changes things. I nodded slowly, because it did. Up until now, most of what we uncovered could be explained away. Misunderstandings, errors in judgment, poor communication. But not anymore. This recording revealed intent. While it might not be legally perfect or definitive, emotionally, it revealed everything.
I sat quietly, trying to process it all, trying to connect those voices to the people I loved. Because that remained the hardest part. I loved them, even now, even after everything that had happened. Love doesn't stop on command. If only it were that easy.
Finally, Robert opened another folder. What's next? I looked up. The question hung between us. What's next? If it had been a month ago, my answer would have been different. I would have avoided conflict, protected their feelings, made excuses and accepted explanations. But not anymore. I thought about Thanksgiving, the folding table, being ignored when I arrived, the conversations that stopped the moment I entered the room, the false concern, the hidden documents, the video, David's letter, everything. Then I made a decision. I want to see them. Both men appeared surprised. Are you sure? Robert asked. You don't have to rush into this. I'm not rushing. I already knew the answer. The decision felt calm, certain, and necessary. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking the truth. There is a difference. Daniel leaned back in his chair. If we do this, it should happen here.
I nodded. Agreed. Neutral ground, a professional environment with witnesses present. No arguing in someone's kitchen, no emotional ambushes, no manipulation. Just the facts.
Robert opened his calendar. We can arrange it. For the next hour, we discussed logistics, dates, documents, evidence, legal considerations, and practical matters. Yet beneath it all existed another reality. Soon I would be sitting across from my children, looking into their eyes, and listening to whatever explanation they chose to offer. A part of me felt terrified. Another part was looking forward to it, because uncertainty is exhausting. At least the truth allows things to move forward. Ultimately, at the end of the meeting, Robert handed me a document. I recognized it immediately, an amendment related to my estate plan, my trust, and my beneficiaries. I looked up. What is this? A choice. I looked closely at the pages. Everything suddenly felt very real. For years I had assumed my estate would automatically pass to my children. Now I understood an important truth. An inheritance isn't a privilege. It's a matter of trust. And trust can be broken. Robert spoke carefully. You don't have to decide today. I nodded, but a part of me had already decided. Not the specific details, not the exact distribution, but something deeper. A recognition that my future would no longer be dictated by guilt, obligation, or fear. When I left the office that afternoon, snow flurries were drifting gently through the air. The world looked peaceful, even beautiful. That's the funny thing about life. The inner turmoil contrast against a calm exterior. I stood by my car for a while, thinking, remembering, mourning, and healing. Then I climbed into the driver's seat, because the next chapter was coming. The confrontation, the meeting, the moment the secrets would finally be brought into the light. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I was ready. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, exactly 10 days after Thanksgiving. 10 days had passed since I quietly walked out of Jennifer's house. Those 10 days felt as long as 10 years. I arrived 15 minutes early to Robert Hayes' office. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted a moment alone. A moment to breathe. A moment to remember why I was here. The conference room was large and professional, with a polished wooden table in the center. Legal folders were arranged neatly at one end. A few bottles of water sat around the room. Everything felt calm, orderly, and controlled. A stark contrast to the emotions about to walk through the door. Robert sat next to me. Daniel sat in a chair against the wall. Neither man said much. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was there, and the decisions had been made. Now, the truth was coming. Right at 10 a.m., the door opened. Jennifer walked in first. Seeing her cracked my heart a little, because despite everything, she was still my daughter. Still the little girl whose nightmares I used to chase away. Still the teenager who cried in my arms after her first heartbreak. Still someone I loved. And that made this much harder. Michael followed behind her, looking tired, older, and stressed. Brian walked in last. The moment he noticed Daniel sitting in the room, his expression changed instantly. Interesting. Very interesting. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Jennifer broke the silence first. "Mom?" Her voice was trembling. I nodded politely. "Jennifer?" Tears immediately filled her eyes. Years ago, that sight would have shattered my resolve. But not today. Today, I needed the truth more than tears. Everyone took a seat, and the room fell quiet again. Robert crossed his hands. "Thank you all for coming."
No one responded.
Jennifer looked directly at me. "We've been worried sick." The phrase echoed in the air. I considered it carefully, then answered honestly. No. Confusion crossed her face. "What?" "You've been frantic, worried about something." I met her gaze. "But I don't think it was me." Her eyes darted away instantly. That reaction spoke volumes. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, this situation has gotten completely out of hand." I nearly laughed. Out of hand. Another interesting phrase. As if the problem weren't the deception, but the fact that the deception had been uncovered. Robert opened a folder. "I think we should start with the facts." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Everyone sat up a bit straighter, especially input from Brian. Robert placed several documents on the table. Property records, financial files, copies of correspondence, evidence. Nothing dramatic, just the truth. And the truth can be devastating. Michael looked at the documents, then at Robert. "What exactly is this?" A review of recent events. Brian leaned back, already defensive, already uncomfortable. Good. For years I had been the uncomfortable one. Now it was their turn. Robert began calmly. "We have evidence that there have been discussions regarding Renee's property." Nobody spoke. "We have evidence of conversations concerning an assisted living facility." Still silence. "And we have evidence of an attempt to gain legal control over assets." Jennifer's face went entirely pale. Michael stared at the table. Brian sat motionless. Then Robert placed the transcript of the video in front of them. That finally provoked a reaction. Brian's jaw tightened. Jennifer looked horrified. Michael closed his eyes. They recognized it instantly. They knew exactly what it was. Silence hung in the room for several seconds. Then Jennifer whispered, "Oh my God," not because she was shocked, but because she had been caught. I felt an unexpected sadness, not satisfaction, sadness, because watching your children realize they can no longer hide brings no joy whatsoever. Robert continued. The recording contains several phrases that require an explanation. No one offered to speak, so he provided the first example. If we can show she's confused, things become much easier. The phrase echoed in the room. Jennifer began to cry. Michael looked physically ill. Brian remained silent. I watched all three of them carefully. Not a single person denied saying it. That was significant. Robert continued. Once the paperwork is processed, none of this will matter. Still silence. Once the house is sold, most of the problems disappear. The room felt smaller, heavier, and harder to breathe in. Finally, I spoke. It was the first thing I had said to them all morning. Which house? Everyone looked at me. I repeated myself. Which house were you planning to sell? Michael swallowed hard. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Brian answered first. A mistake. A very big mistake. Renee.
No. I raised a hand, and his mouth shut instantly. You do not get to call me Renee.
The room went completely quiet. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in Brian's eyes. Good. I continued. You spent months discussing my future without me. My voice remained calm, steady, and controlled. You discussed moving me away. Nobody responded. You discussed my property. Still silence. And you discussed how to show I was confused. Jennifer cried harder. I looked directly at her. Did you think to ask me what I wanted even once? Her shoulders slumped. No. The answer barely escaped her lips, but it was enough. No. One word. A devastating word, because it contained the truth. No, they hadn't asked. Not once. I turned to Michael. Did you? He stared at the table. No. Another truth, another wound. Then I looked at Brian, the architect, the person at the center of it all. And you? His expression hardened. For the first time, defense replaced fear. We were trying to help. The phrase nearly made me laugh. Help. What a beautiful word. What an ugly excuse. I asked calmly, help me, or help yourselves. The silence answered for him. Robert slid another document across the table, and Brian recognized it immediately. The debt report. The color drained from his face. Now everyone knew. Jennifer looked at the numbers, then at her husband. What is this? Brian didn't answer.
She looked again. What is this?
Still silence. Then the slow, painful realization hit her. The second mortgage, the loans, the business debt, everything. Jennifer stared at him as if looking at a stranger. The tears stopped, replaced by shock.
You told me we were fine.
Brian turned his head away, and at that moment, everything unraveled. Not because of me, but because lies can rarely survive in the sunlight. Michael finally spoke, his voice sounding defeated. It wasn't supposed to get to this point. I looked at him. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions, now an adult man sitting across from me. Where was it supposed to go? There was no answer because there wasn't one, only regret, and regret arrived too late. A few minutes later, Jennifer spoke, her voice barely audible. I was angry.
The confession surprised everyone, including herself. I kept quiet to let her continue.
After Dad died, the tears returned. Everyone talked about how much he loved you. The room became very quiet, very still. I know it sounds ridiculous, she grimaced through her tears, but I was jealous. I blinked, not because I understood, but because I had never anticipated those words. Jennifer wiped her face. He always put you first, pain filled her expression. And I hated that. The confession felt honest, raw, and unexpected. Perhaps it was the first time that morning that a truth rather than an excuse had emerged. An ugly truth, but the truth nonetheless. Michael stared at his sister in shock. Brian kept his eyes away. And I sat there, realizing something heartbreaking. This wasn't just about money. Money accelerated everything, but beneath it all existed years of resentment, insecurities, jealousy, weakness, unhealed wounds. Human flaws that, if left unaddressed, tear families apart. I looked around the room at my children, at the evidence, and at the damage caused. Then I realized an important reality. This confrontation wasn't really about proving guilt. We already knew that. It was about deciding what happens next. And that decision belonged to me. Silence remained in the room after Jennifer's confession. No one seemed to know what to say next, not even Robert. For a long time, all we could hear was the faint hum of the heating system. I looked around the table at my daughter, my son, and my son-in-law. People I had loved for decades, people I still loved, and the people who had hurt me deeper than anyone else ever could. The strange thing about betrayal is that eventually the anger burns out, leaving behind pure sadness. Not just sadness for what happened, but sadness for what could have been, what should have been. I folded my hands together and spoke, my voice not loud or dramatic, just earnest. When your father passed away, I lost the love of my life. Nobody interrupted. I lost my best friend. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Michael stared at the table. I continued. After that, I spent years trying to hold this family together. Memories rushed into my mind. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, hospital visits, graduations, phone calls, and family dinners. Thousands of tiny acts of love. Thousands of sacrifices no one ever saw. I kept inviting everyone over. My voice trembled slightly. I kept calling. Nobody moved. I kept showing up. I looked directly at Jennifer, even when you had stopped responding.
New tears rolled down her cheeks.
Then I turned to Michael. Even when every conversation turned into a discussion about paperwork, his eyes filled with shame. I wasn't trying to hurt him. The truth was doing the work on its own. Finally, I looked at Brian. The silence between us stretched out, long, uncomfortable, and necessary. You viewed me as an asset. He shook his head immediately. No. I raised a hand. Stop. The word halted him because we both knew. The evidence spoke for itself. The recording, the meetings, the debt, the forged signature, everything. There was nothing left to argue. For the first time since entering the room, Brian appeared truly defeated. Not angry, not defensive, just defeated. Perhaps that was appropriate, because every plan he had constructed was collapsing. Not because I destroyed it, but because it was fundamentally wrong from the start. I took a deep breath and reached into my folder for several documents Robert had prepared. Documents I had reviewed repeatedly, representing a decision, the most significant decision of my life. I pushed them across the table. Jennifer frowned. Michael looked confused, and Brian recognized them instantly. The trust documents, the estate files, the amendments to the beneficiaries. The room became incredibly quiet. Robert explained calmly, "Renee has made modifications." Nobody spoke. Jennifer's face went white. Michael looked stunned. For the first time in my life, I realized an important reality. Months ago, this moment would have terrified me, but not anymore. Because I wasn't acting out of anger, I was acting out of clarity. There is a difference, a massive difference. I looked directly at my children.
You spent months deciding my future. My voice remained calm. So now I am deciding my own.
Jennifer began to cry again. "Mom, please." I shook my head gently. "You need to listen to this." She went quiet, and everyone else did too. For years I believed that love meant endless forgiveness. I paused. I was wrong. The room remained dead silent. Love without boundaries becomes enabling. The phrase seemed to land heavily, especially on Jennifer and Michael. I continued. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. More silence. You can forgive someone and still refuse to allow them to hurt you again. I looked down at the documents, then back up at them. That is what I am doing now. Nobody argued, nobody denied it, because there was nothing left to deny. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice sounding broken. "Now what?" The question lingered in the air. Now what? For days I had been asking myself the same question, and now I finally knew the answer. "I'm leaving." Jennifer stared at me. "What?" "I'm leaving." The words felt remarkably peaceful, not bitter, not dramatic, just calm. Michael blinked. "Leaving to go where?" I smiled slightly. For the first time in my life, I don't need to tell anyone. That wasn't cruel. It was a freedom I hadn't experienced in decades. Jennifer shook her head. "You can't mean forever." I considered the question carefully, then answered honestly, "Not forever." A look of relief flashed across her face for just a second before I finished the sentence. But things will never go back to the way they were. The relief vanished because she understood. We all did. The old relationships were gone. Trust, once broken, doesn't magically reappear. It has to be rebuilt slowly, patiently, and honestly. And that process hadn't even begun. I turned to Michael, his eyes red. "I love you." The statement caught him off guard, perhaps because he expected anger, punishment, or hatred. Instead, he got the truth. "I will always love you." Tears filled his eyes. "But loving you does not require me to surrender my dignity." He lowered his head, unable to respond. Then I looked at Jennifer, the daughter I once believed would always be my best friend. "I love you too." She wept openly. But I continued, "But you do not get to dictate my future." Another truth, another boundary, another necessary wound. Finally, I pulled out the last document, a decision I was entirely certain of. I pushed it forward. Robert smiled softly. He already knew. Jennifer looked confused. Michael looked confused, and Brian looked terrified. Only Robert understood immediately. "What is that?" Jennifer asked. I smiled for the first time that day, a genuine smile. "A gift." She frowned. "A gift?"
I nodded. To the person who actually treated me like family.
Silence filled the room, and then they slowly understood. "Emma." Jennifer's eyes widened, and Michael leaned back in his chair. I continued. "Emma never asked me for money. Nobody spoke. She never inquired about my property. Still silence. And she never discussed my competency." Jennifer closed her eyes. She just loved me. The room went quiet again. A beautiful quiet, because nobody could argue at that point. Nobody. I hadn't disinherited everyone out of revenge, but I was recognizing character. And character matters, especially when money enters the room. The meeting ended shortly after, not dramatically. There was no screaming, no threats, no theatrical exits. Just the truth, a painful, necessary truth. As everyone stood up to leave, Jennifer approached me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and then she whispered, "I'm sorry." The phrase sounded sincere, and for the first time, I believed her. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was enough to listen, enough to accept. I gave her a brief hug and stepped back. Michael embraced me too, his shoulders shaking slightly. I held him for a moment before letting go. Brian never approached. Perhaps he understood there was nothing left to say, or perhaps he knew some damages take years to fix. Maybe longer. As I walked toward the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't. And not because justice was satisfying, it wasn't. I felt lighter because I had finally chosen myself, after spending a lifetime choosing everyone else. When I walked out into the cold afternoon air, I realized an important reality. The woman who had walked away from Thanksgiving dinner, unnoticed, was gone, replaced by a woman who finally understood her own worth. A woman who no longer needed permission to live her life. 1 year later, I was standing in a kitchen filled with laughter. Real laughter, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that doesn't hide secrets, and the kind that doesn't vanish when someone enters the room. Outside, the Thanksgiving morning sun streamed through the windows of my new home in North Carolina. The air was thick with the aroma of cinnamon, roasting turkey, and fresh bread. Music played softly from a speaker near the counter. For the first time in many years, I felt entirely at peace. If anyone had told me over a year ago that I would be spending Thanksgiving hundreds of miles away from Ohio, I would have laughed. Back then, my entire identity revolved around family. Not a healthy family, but an exhausting one. The kind where your value is determined by how much you sacrifice. The kind where your needs are always placed last, and the kind where you slowly lose yourself while convincing yourself that this is love. I didn't understand it then. I do now. After the meeting in Robert's office, I made a decision. A real decision. Not an emotional reaction, not a dramatic escape, but a choice. I moved to North Carolina, not because I was running away, but because I was moving towards something. Toward peace. Toward freedom. And toward the life I had postponed for decades. During our marriage, David and I had visited North Carolina several times. We always loved the slower pace of life, the mountains, the lakes, and the friendly people. The sense that life didn't have to be rushed. After he died, I often imagined what it would be like to retire there. Eventually, I stopped imagining and started living. The first few months weren't easy. There were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, and moments of wondering if I had made the right decision. Change is difficult at any age, perhaps even more so later in life. But something unexpected happened. Free from the chaos, I began to hear my own thoughts again. I started reading more, walking more, and laughing more. I joined a community centre and volunteered twice a week, meeting people who knew nothing about family drama, property disputes, or betrayal. People who simply enjoyed my company for who I was, not for what I owned. That alone felt like a revolution. One afternoon, I met a fellow widow named Carol during a volunteer event, then another lady named Susan, followed by a retired teacher named Helen. Friendships formed naturally, not because anyone needed anything, but because we genuinely enjoyed spending time together. It reminded me that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's constructed from kindness, respect, and consistency. The very things that had been missing from my previous life. The Thanksgiving gathering I hosted that year reflected that lesson. Some of the guests were friends, some were widows and widowers from the community, and others were people who simply had nowhere else to go. One gentleman had lost his wife 2 years ago. Another lady had no living relatives, and a veteran arrived with a homemade pie. Everyone brought something. Everyone contributed, and everyone belonged. Nobody sat at a folding table in the corner. Nobody felt invisible. That meant more to me than anyone realized. While I was checking the turkey in the oven, my phone buzzed with a message. I already knew who it was from. Jennifer. I stared at the screen for a moment. A year ago, seeing her name would have filled me with anxiety. Now it filled me with something else. Acceptance. Not complete healing, but acceptance. After that meeting, our relationship changed drastically. The initial months were tough, filled with painful conversations, awkward silences, honest apologies, and a slow process of rebuilding. Trust wasn't restored overnight, nor should it have been, but effort mattered, and consistency mattered. To her credit, Jennifer had been trying. The message was simple. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. I love you. I smiled and replied, Happy Thanksgiving. I love you too. Because despite everything, love remained. Love survived. Trust required rebuilding, but love lived on. A moment later, a second message arrived from Michael. Happy Thanksgiving, Mum. The message continued. Thank you for giving us a chance to do better. I stared at it for a moment, then smiled, because that was exactly what I had always wanted. Not perfection, but growth, accountability, and honesty. I sent a brief reply. Happy Thanksgiving, Michael. The reality was that the past year had changed him too. The financial crisis forced difficult conversations, tough truths, and painful lessons. For the first time in years, he stopped viewing me as the person who would always bail him out. And strangely, that improved our relationship. Boundaries often have that effect, not because they create distance, but because they create respect. The front door opened, and a familiar voice filled the house. Grandma! My face lit up instantly. Emma. She rushed into the kitchen and hugged me tightly. I held her back, keeping the embrace longer than usual. Because some people deserve more gratitude, and Emma was undoubtedly one of them. She had visited me several times over the year, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jennifer. Her honesty had changed everything, not because she revealed secrets, but because she chose integrity. A rare quality. A precious quality. She stepped back and smiled. It smells amazing in here. I laughed. Good answer. She grinned. I learned from the best.
Maybe not, but I knew one thing. Emma had become a living reminder that character matters more than inheritance, more than money, and more than property. Far more.
The afternoon flew by as guests arrived. Food was served, stories were shared, and laughter echoed through the house. For a moment I walked out onto the back porch alone. Just a small moment, long enough to look at the mountains in the distance. The air felt crisp, clean, and peaceful. I thought about Thanksgiving a year ago. The ignored conversations, the folding table, the silent exit, the heartbreak, the betrayal. Everything. Then I thought about where I was now, surrounded by people who appreciated me, living a life I chose. Free from guilt, free from manipulation, and free from the need to earn love through sacrifice. A strange realization washed over me. I wasn't grateful for what happened. I would never be grateful for betrayal, but I was grateful for what it revealed. Because sometimes losing the wrong table is exactly how you find the right one. The old Thanksgiving table was built on obligation. This table was built on respect. The old table made me feel invisible. This table made me feel seen. The old table belonged to the life I thought I needed. This table belonged to the life I actually deserved.
Inside, someone called my name. Dinner was ready. I smiled and turned toward the door, toward the warmth, toward the laughter, and toward the people waiting for me. Not because they needed something, but because they wanted me there.
As I walked back inside, I realized that the moment I quietly walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning.
The beginning of a life where I finally understood my worth, a life where love and respect coexisted, and a life where I no longer sat at someone else's table, hoping to be noticed.
I'd built my own table, and everyone sitting around it knew exactly who I was. In every painful chapter of our lives, a lesson is hidden. But sometimes we are hurt too deeply to see it until much later. For many years, I thought being a good mother meant always saying yes. I thought sacrifice was the highest form of love. I thought that if I just gave enough, forgave enough, and endured enough, everything would eventually be fine. Life taught me something different. Love cannot survive without respect. Kindness without boundaries eventually becomes a passport for others to take advantage of you. And forgiveness does not require you to accept repeated harm. Getting older doesn't make you less valuable. It doesn't make your voice less important. It doesn't mean your dreams, your peace, or your future belongs to someone else. No matter your age, you have the right to make your own choices, the right to protect your dignity, and the right to walk away from people who only notice your worth when they need something from you. Most importantly, it's never too late to start over. Sometimes the new life waiting for us is just on the other side of a difficult goodbye. Sometimes the people who truly appreciate us aren't the ones we expect. And sometimes losing what we thought we needed makes room for something much better. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between maintaining the peace and protecting your self-respect? Share your experiences in the comments below. If you enjoy stories about family resilience, healing, and emotional justice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me. No matter where you're watching from today, remember this: you deserve to be loved and you deserve to be respected. You're never too old to start a new chapter.